place where even the able-bodied can lose themselves. A princess in a wheelchair would have trouble finding those blackberries, I thought as I crept through the bushes. And then I stopped, briefly, and smiled. A princess in a wheelchair? Who ever heard of such a thing? But by the time I reached the blackberry bush, that unknown princess in her wheelchair was all I could think about. That princess and the 7 dwarfs who helped Snow White, and Rumpelstiltskin, and the ugliness of the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, the evil queen in Snow White, who transforms herself into a hunchbacked old woman, the prince who goes blind after the witch casts Rapunzel from her tower, the princess who falls into a long, enchanted sleep, the witch with the crutch in Hansel and Gretel, the stepsisters who get their eyes plucked out by doves in Aschenputtel, the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, and all the ugly princes and princesses who gain the throne by their cunning and then are made or revealed to be beautiful after all. And suddenly, I was no longer alone in the forest. Suddenly, I was thinking about these connections, disability and fairy tales. How obvious. How had I not considered these things before? This needed to be an essay, I thought. But no doubt it was already an essay. No doubt the link between fairy tales and disability had been written about 1,000,000 times before. There was so much in there that one could write about. People far smarter than I had no doubt already done it, and done it well. I filled my soul with blackberries and went back to my cottage. I went back to working on the novel. I also kept thinking about that long stretch of moments in the forest. Disability and fairy tales. Disability in fairy tales. When I got home, I did some research and found surprisingly little on the topic. Sure that I was missing something, I dug a little harder. My digging brought me Anne Schmeising and her wonderful book, Disability, Deformity, and Disease in the Grimm's Fairy Tales. My digging brought me to Sharon Snyder and David T. Mitchell and their work on narrative prosthesis, to the work of disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers, to the fantastic breadth of scholarship afforded by Jack Sipes. And it brought me, again, to the fairy tales. So many darker versions of the Disney stories that I'd known as a child, and so many darker moments in the Disney stories, too. Why was Scar, the villain of The Lion King, known only by the mark that slashed his face? Why did the depiction of the hunchback Quasimodo make my skin crawl? Why hadn't I ever thought of the Little Mermaid's Ariel in those moments just after she'd arrived on land with legs and seen myself in her unsteady posture and stumbling? Why, in all of these stories about someone who wants to be something or someone else, was it always the individual who needed to change, and never the world? Disfigured is my attempt at unraveling some of the more well-known Western fairy tale archetypes in light of a disability rights framework. In order to understand how we move on from the damage that these archetypes can do, we first need to understand what put them in place, why the disfigured body has historically been seen as less than whole, why fairy tales, narratives so often associated with seeming empowerment, have provided a breeding ground for anti-disability narrative, and how the allure and the potency of these stories has continued to influence the perceptions of disability today. To reclaim disability narrative and storytelling, we need to understand why stories like fairy tales have been fascinated with it right from the very beginning, and how the stories we tell have maligned difference and disability in order to make sense of it in the world. A few notes. As someone who grew up on Western fairy tales and their various interpretations, it is my intention to stay in my lane, as it were, and focus the majority of this book on fairy tales and several pop culture hero narratives that are familiar to a Western audience. While I make mention of several tales from other cultures in an effort to show the pervasiveness of certain archetypes, the bulk of this book remains focused on Western stories and several modern interpretations that stem from predominantly European frameworks. I very much hope this book can contribute to the conversations around disability and fairy tales from other cultures, and look forward to continued learning about this. It's also important to